I think it covers almost all aspects, legal, moral, comparing India's track record in the disputed region with the international conventions regarding human rights or civil rights or political rights, and also pinpoints a variety of human rights violations. But it starts with mentioning some of the most draconian laws that the Indian state establishment has enforced and imposed in the disputed region, not just for the past few years, but for the past several years and even decades. Some of these laws operate across India, others are specifically targeted on the Kashmiri population. And all of these set of laws basically reinforce each other with one objective in mind: how to suppress the will of a freedom-loving people. The report also, after mentioning the laws which create a system of terror, promote a culture of violating human rights and culture of deniability of these acts taking place by the Indian state authorities. And then in the second portion, the very mention of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights main provisions, plus the provisions of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as a couple of important conventions on terror, on torture and enforced disappearances that the Indian state establishment has not ratified. It basically then creates a contradiction between the existing legal machinery as being operative in the disputed region and the moral and legal responsibilities of a member state of the United Nations, which India is. So this paradox and contradiction is made acutely clear in the first two portions of the report. And then it touches the same issues which the Honorable Chair already highlighted, the 169 recommendations which the working group of this council in the meeting in May, June this year came forward, and India is required to implement them and undertake reformations as required by these recommendations. And then the council also gives its own response to these recommendations and finally concludes with a very pinpointed appeal on urging India and actually requesting the international community to pressure India to repeal the draconian laws, to avoid and take steps which should prevent the grave violation of human rights, and undertake independent investigations which are free of state or security establishment's control to verify as to what happened during a couple of recent case studies of gang rape and mass murder, especially targeting the youth population of the Valley of Kashmir. Now, there are 2 points I would say about the report in question. First of all, it is very comprehensive. Prior to getting hold of this report, I looked around, I Googled, and I could find scattered reports, commentaries about the situation. So in this report, you can get everything that you would look for hours, covering almost all aspects of the situation. It brings together a variety of issues which are crucial to the understanding of the human rights crisis in Kashmir in one place. Secondly, it provides an answer to the 4 W's and 1 H. Where, what, when are important things. They should be mentioned because they are factual narrative on the basis of which we try to answer 2 crucial questions, which is that of why. Why does India do that? And how these draconian laws and its equally draconian effects have taken place all of these years and decades in a disputed region which morally, legally, historically does not belong and cannot be claimed by the state of India, and which is a disputed region recognized as such by the entire international community, including the United Nations. And it also highlights the reasons why India does not sign 2 of the crucial UN conventions. It has signed one, but it has not ratified. It is not willing to ratify it years after years. It also tells us as to why so many requests have been made by the UN, by the Office of the UN Commissioner on Human Rights to the Indian state, and there has been no response yet. And I would also, taking the debate further, fundamentally agree with the point that Mir Wais just raised. And I think that is the crux of the issue. We are talking about a humanitarian catastrophic situation. But there is a larger political factor behind it. That unless there cannot be a humanitarian response to a humanitarian situation, that humanitarian catastrophe is occurring in a wider political historical context. That is why, as long as there is no political solution to this age-old Kashmir dispute, and as long as the international community does not exercise due pressure on the state of India, then we can only be talking about symptoms of a problem and will always remain away from finding a durable solution. And in fact, in my nearly 17 or 18 years of research and work on South Asian security issues, including Kashmir, I just looked at an article which I wrote in the early 90s, based on a very expanded report by the UN Human Rights Watch and Physicians for Human Rights. It was published in 1993. And I tell you, this thing that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are talking about in 2012 is the same which these 2 organizations were talking about in 1993. Nothing has basically changed. What has India done all these years? Number 1, instead of listening to the voices which are raised every year in this August forum, it has always attempted to find a scapegoat. Number 1, it has always tried to externalize the problem. Now, I understand, and this is the point I am making because of my discipline of international relations. I can't help it. We can understand that there are 3 phases in the Kashmiri liberation struggle. One was completely non-violent, pacifist, bearing all the torture, all the denial of basic rights, expecting the United Nations to deliver on its promises, continues until the late 1980s. Now, from the late 1980s until the start of the 2000s, there was a regional situation. The international community abandons a region, a country, bringing all the fighters from all across the Muslim world and leaves. And a situation is created in which violence occurs from non-state actors as well. But it occurs in an environment where there is a disputed territory and you have nearly 700,000 army, paramilitary and police, perhaps the largest concentration of military force in any small territory that the world has seen in the last 20 years or so. So that was the context. So in which terrorism might have taken place. But when a non-state actor or an organization engages in militancy, say in our frontier or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or tribal regions of Pakistan, since they belong to Pakistan, they are part of the territorial integrity of Pakistan, then it is very difficult for organizations even championing their rights to say that Pakistani state authorities are acting in some kind of human rights violations are taking place. But in a disputed territory, if violence takes place even from non-state actors, given the disputed nature of the territory itself, you cannot really qualify this kind of violence with the same violence which occurs in a territorially integral nation state of the world. And then starts the third phase in which, and in my own writings back in the 1990s, I always emphasized that the core of the issue of Kashmir was self-determination, which was an objective or a goal which the Palestinians also demand, which the Bosnians try to achieve, which every suppressive community all across the world tries to achieve. And this is the basic point which I would try to assert as well, that limiting the issue of Kashmir to ethnicity, territory, history, or even religion is amounts to doing injustice to the Kashmir cause. Kashmir cause has always been about people. It is a humanitarian issue. It is about people's rights. It is about people's aspirations. And that is something which has been negated by India all along these decades. You go back 20 years, you go back to 2010, look at all the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, so many other reports emanating from NGOs for human rights working inside India. You will notice that the Indian security forces continue to have impunity of whatever they do, which is what all these laws, which were mentioned by Mir Wais Saab and other speakers before, try to achieve. And you have this callousness. This callousness is reflected, say, in the last 2 months. I can give you 2 examples. 2 years ago, Lok Sabha, the lower house of Indian Parliament, passed a bill on the prevention of torture. Then this bill was referred to a select committee of the upper house. And this bill is lying somewhere. A couple of months ago, Salman Khurshid, the Indian Law and Justice Minister, was asked in Delhi by correspondents and even some activists of the civil society as to what is happening about this bill. Although this bill is fundamentally flawed, even in its revised shape, the International Committee of the Jurists pinpoints so many fundamental flaws in it. But the response of the minister was that he doesn't know what is happening to this bill. And a bill that was passed by the lower house 2 years ago only after 2 hours debate. So much for India's commitment to the protection of human rights inside India and especially in the disputed territory.